The Capitol stood silent in the pre-dawn gray, a colossal marble skeleton awaiting the infusion of conflict that was its daily lifeblood. Rain from the night before clung to the dome, tracing silver paths down its iron curves, mimicking tears. The city was too proud to shed. Below, on the rain-slicked pavement of the East Front, a single black Suburban idled, its engine a low thrum against the quiet hum of Washington, D.C. waking up. The door opened and Speaker Nancy Pelosi emerged, a figure of disciplined silhouette against the pale light. Her stride was brisk, economical, each step on the hallowed stone a testament to decades spent navigating these corridors of power. She did not look up at the Statue of Freedom. Her gaze was fixed forward on the great bronze doors of the House of Representatives, a portal to her kingdom and her battlefield dot inside. The air was cool and smelled of floor wax and old paper. The ghosts of past debates and whispered conspiracies lingered in the vast, empty spaces of the rotunda. The Speaker's heels clicked a sharp, metronomic beat on the marble, the only sound in the cavernous hall. She moved not like a visitor, but as an integral component of the building itself, a keystone holding a precarious arch together. Her office, when she reached it, was already bathed in the soft glow of a desk lamp. The room was an extension of her own persona, impeccably ordered, steeped in history, every object placed with deliberate intention. On the vast mahogany desk, positioned dead center, lay the source of the coming storm. It was not yet a bill, but a testament, a thick stack of paper bound in blue, bearing the title, The American Renewal and Infrastructure Act, thousands of pages detailing the rebuilding of a nation's arteries, bridges, roads, ports, broadband lines. To her, it was a legacy document, a modern-day New Deal etched in legislative text. She slid into her high-backed leather chair, the worn material sighing under her weight. She did not open the document. She knew its contents by heart, its every clause and fiscal allocation. Instead, she put on her reading glasses, the motion precise and practiced, and picked up a single-page summary, a whip count prepared by her staff. Her lips, a thin line of determination, barely moved as her eyes scanned the columns of names, yea, nay, undecided. The third column was far too long. A quiet rage, cold and controlled, settled deep in her chest. It was the rage of a master architect, whose grand design was being threatened by vandals miles away. In a glass-walled office in a less historic, more corporate corner of the Capitol complex, the atmosphere was entirely different. Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy was already in motion, pacing the length of his office like a caged panther. The room was modern, functional, decorated not with portraits of past statesmen, but with framed photographs of himself, shaking hands, giving speeches, always smiling, always on the offensive. A half-dozen aides and strategists were scattered on sofas and chairs, a palpable nervous energy emanating from them as they watched their leader. McCarthy's sleeves were rolled up, his tie loosened, a visual cue of a man ready for a street fight, not a parliamentary debate. He gestured emphatically towards a massive whiteboard that dominated one wall. On it, scrawled in angry red marker, were not names, but words and phrases: DEBT crisis, tax hikes on families, socialist wish list, partisan power grab, bloated, corrupt. To him, the Speaker's bill was not a blueprint for national renewal. It was a Trojan horse, stuffed with progressive fantasies and designed to bankrupt the country while solidifying his rival's power. He wasn't just opposing a piece of legislation. He was defending an entire philosophy. He saw himself as the last bulwark against a tide of fiscal insanity. He stopped his pacing and slapped the whiteboard with the flat of his hand, the sound cracking through the room. His team flinched. He pointed to the phrase, partisan power grab. His glare was a silent command. This is the narrative. This is the weapon. He wanted to make the bill so toxic that any member of his party, any wavering Democrat, would fear touching it lest their own political career be contaminated. His fight wasn't about the merits of a new bridge in Ohio. It was about wresting control of the national story, a story he believed Pelosi had hijacked. The sun was higher now, casting long, sharp-edged shadows across the city. The truce of the dawn was over. The Capitol was filling up, a slow transfusion of dark suits, chattering aides, and predatory journalists. The building hummed with a low-grade anticipatory fever. In the Speaker's lobby, just off the House floor, the two worlds collided, not in person, but in ethos. Pelosi's senior legislative director, a young, ferociously intelligent man named Julian Vance, moved through the scrum with a preternatural calm. He was the Speaker's scalpel, tasked with the delicate surgery of securing votes. His face was a mask of pleasant neutrality, but his eyes were constantly scanning, logging every whispered conversation, every handshake that lingered a second too long. He held a leather-bound folio, a portable version of the whip count board from the Speaker's office. He passed a moderate Democrat from a swing district and offered a thin, knowing smile, a silent reminder of a federal grant for a community college in her district that the Speaker had personally championed months earlier. A down payment, a token, a fealty expected in return. A few feet away, McCarthy's chief of staff, a burly ex-Marine with a perpetually clenched jaw, was doing the opposite. He wasn't cajoling, he was warning. He stood with a trio of restless conservative members, his posture radiating intimidation. He clapped one on the back, a gesture that looked less like camaraderie and more like a warning shot. His message, delivered in a low rumble a C-SPAN microphone could never catch, was clear. Defy the leader, defy the party, and you will find yourself friendless, fundless, and facing a primary challenger before the ink is dry. The first official skirmish took place not on the floor, but in the sterile, wood-paneled confines of the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee. The room was packed, the air thick with the heat of television lights and animosity. Pelosi did not attend. Her physical absence was a power move in itself. She would not dignify this preliminary dissection of her masterpiece with her presence. She watched the proceedings on a monitor in her office, her face unreadable. She saw the ranking Republican member, a loyal McCarthy lieutenant, read from a prepared statement. Every key phrase from the whiteboard in the leader's office was repeated, polished for public consumption. The words echoed, accusing the bill of being a fiscally irresponsible behemoth. The Democratic chairman, a Pelosi loyalist, retorted, his voice rising with theatrical indignation, defending the bill as a once-in-a-generation investment in the nation's future. It was a pantomime, a carefully choreographed performance for the cameras. The real work was happening elsewhere. While the committee members postured, Julian Vance was in the Rayburn House office building cafeteria, a place of determinedly unglamorous functionality. He sat opposite a freshman Republican, a young man from a sprawling suburban district whose constituents commuted on crumbling highways and relied on spotty rural broadband. The freshman picked at his salad, his nervousness a palpable thing. He hadn't sought this meeting. Julian spoke, his voice low and even, the words themselves stripped of overt threats or promises, yet heavy with their implications. The conversation, to an outside observer, would sound like a dry technical discussion about zoning variances for a proposed data center hub. But both men understood the subtext. The data center meant thousands of high-tech jobs. The Speaker's office had influence over the federal commission that would approve the location. Julian wasn't offering a bribe. He was merely laying out a series of potential events, a causal chain. If the infrastructure bill passed, a certain spirit of bipartisan cooperation might blossom. This spirit could hypothetically grease the wheels at the commission. If the bill failed, a chill might descend. Wheels might grind to a halt. The freshman congressman pushed his salad away, his appetite gone. Julian simply took a sip of his water, his expression unchanged. He had planted a seed of exquisitely tailored self-interest. He logged the freshman's name in his folio, moving him from the nay column to undecided. A small victory in a long war. McCarthy, meanwhile, was escalating the public-facing war. He bypassed the committee hearing entirely, taking a private jet to a rally in a critical swing state. He stood on a stage, the sun beating down, not in a suit, but in an open-collared shirt and jeans, the uniform of the populist warrior. The crowd before him was a sea of red hats and angry signs. He spoke without notes, his voice raw with manufactured outrage. He held up a copy of the bill, hundreds of pages thick, and ridiculed its contents, cherry-picking line items out of context funding for a study on migratory birds, a grant for public art installations, and presenting them as proof of wasteful, decadent spending. He painted a picture of an elite, out-of-touch speaker in her San Francisco enclave, forcing her coastal values onto the hard-working heartland. Every cheer, every roar of approval from the crowd, was a bulletin sent back to Washington, a blast of pressure aimed directly at any of his members who were even considering a yay vote. He wasn't just counting votes. He was stoking a fire, hoping the heat would become too intense for anyone to cross him. Back in the Capitol, the day bled into evening. The golden hour light streamed through the arched windows of the Speaker's office, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. The whip count page was covered in fresh annotations, a complex tapestry of political calculus. Pelosi sat with her inner circle. Julian stood by the desk, presenting his report on the wavering members. The news was mixed. The freshman was leaning, but not committed. Two others had moved into their column after quiet assurances about waterway dredging projects in their districts. But McCarthy's media blitz was working. A veteran Democrat from a deep red state was now balking, his office flooded with calls from constituents who had seen the leader's rally on the evening news. He was terrified. They had gained 3 but were now in danger of losing one of their own. Pelosi listened without interruption, her fingers steepled before her. Her gaze shifted from the whip count to the bill itself, still sitting on her desk. The weight of it seemed to fill the room. The grand vision was being chipped away, held hostage by 1,000 tiny, parochial concerns and a gale force wind of partisan opposition. For the first time that day, a flicker of something other than icy resolve crossed her face. It was a fleeting shadow of weariness, the immense fatigue of a general fighting a war on too many fronts. She picked up a heavy, ornate letter opener, its point dangerously sharp, and began tapping it softly on the blue cover of the bill. Tap, tap, tap. It was the sound of a clock ticking, each tap a moment closer to a vote that was, as of that moment, still unwinnable. The city was dark now, but in the twin bastions of power, the lights burned on, illuminating 2 commanders, 2 conflicting visions, and the immense, grinding work of political warfare. The second week of the fight descended on Washington like a suffocating blanket of summer humidity. The air in the Capitol corridors grew thick with rumor and paranoia. Every nod was interpreted, every closed-door meeting a source of feverish speculation. The battle had moved beyond the realm of policy and into a brutal psychological war of attrition. Aides, bleary-eyed from 18-hour days fueled by stale coffee and adrenaline, passed each other in the tunnels connecting the House office buildings with the vacant stairs of trench soldiers. The initial volleys of public rhetoric had given way to a more insidious form of combat, fought in the shadows, over text messages, and in the quiet, carpeted offices far from any camera. Speaker Pelosi adjusted her strategy. The grand sweeping vision of the bill was, for the moment, set aside. The fight now was a ground game, a block-by-block struggle for every single vote. She had transformed her office into a central nervous system, with Julian Vance as its primary ganglion. The whipboard was now a complex color-coded battlefield map, Green tags for solid yeas, red for intransigent nays. Yellow for the undecided, the ones whose souls were up for grabs. And now a new color had been added, pink for her own Democratic members who were wavering under the intense pressure of McCarthy's sustained assault. The pink tags were an intolerable insult, a weakness in her own ranks that had to be cauterized. She summoned the leader of the Progressive Caucus, a firebrand congresswoman with a formidable grassroots following, to her office. No aides were present. The meeting was a silent testament to Pelosi's power. The congresswoman had been vocal that the bill was too timid, a compromise that gave away too much. Pelosi listened, her expression a study in imperial patience. She did not argue or debate. She simply let the silence hang in the air after the complaints were exhausted. Then, with a quiet, deliberate motion, she slid a folder across the polished desk. It contained internal polling data from the congresswoman's own district. The numbers were stark. While her progressive base was secure, a significant portion of swing voters in her newly redistricted territory were highly favorable to the specific infrastructure projects, a light rail extension and lead pipe replacement, that were core components of the bill. The implication was unspoken, but crystal clear. Kill the bill, and you kill the projects your new constituents desperately want. You can be a martyr for ideological purity, or you can be a congresswoman who delivers. The choice is yours. The congresswoman left the office 15 minutes later, her face grim. The next morning, she issued a press release, still critical of the bill's shortcomings, but ultimately offering her reluctant support. One pink tag was flipped back to green. McCarthy, sensing the shift, escalated his own internal enforcement. He couldn't match Pelosi's intricate system of carrots, so he sharpened his sticks. He called a special conference meeting in the cavernous room in the Capitol's basement. The mood was tense. He didn't shout. His voice was low, laced with a chilling disappointment. He spoke of party unity, of the shared mission to halt the socialist spending spree. Then, he directed his gaze toward the young freshman Republican Julian had been courting. He never mentioned the data center or the zoning commission, but he spoke of the dangers of parochial interests and the siren song of a Washington deal. He announced, almost as an aside, his new appointments to the most sought-after committees for the next term. Key allies were rewarded with prized spots on Ways and Means, on appropriations. He then mentioned, with feigned regret, how difficult it was to find spots for everyone, especially for those who couldn't be relied upon in a critical fight. The threat was elegant in its brutality. Vote with Pelosi, and you can explain to your constituents why you're stuck on the Small Business Committee, while the congressman in the next district over is directing billions of dollars from a seat on the Appropriations Committee. The young Republican stared at his hands, the blood draining from his face. Later that day, he issued a statement decrying the bloated infrastructure bill, his language a near-perfect echo of McCarthy's whiteboard. On Julian's map, a yellow tag was flipped with decisive finality to red. The score was evened, the war of information intensified. Opposition research teams on both sides dug frantically through archives, searching for any scrap of leverage. McCarthy's team found what they thought was a silver bullet. Buried on page 1832 of the bill was an arcane provision establishing a pilot program for a per-mile road usage fee in 3 designated urban areas. In reality, it was a tiny bipartisan proposal from a previous failed transportation bill, meant to explore long-term solutions for the Highway Trust Fund's insolvency. But in the hands of McCarthy's cum shop, it was transformed into a secret driving tax. The phrase was explosive, perfectly tailored for viral outrage. Within hours, it was the lead story on conservative news networks. Graphics of odometers clicking over to dollar signs filled the screen. Phone lines on Capitol Hill lit up. The attack was brutally effective, shaking even the most secure Democrats. The narrative was simple, terrifying, and easily shareable. It didn't matter that it was a gross mischaracterization. It was a story, and it was winning. Pelosi watched the coverage from her office, a flicker of genuine anger breaking through her composure. She slammed her palm on the desk, not with the performative crack of McCarthy, but with a solid, dense thud of fury. This was a violation of the unspoken rules, a deliberate torching of substance for the sake of political arson. She saw the panic beginning to creep into her caucus. The pink tags on the whipboard were multiplying again. The momentum had shifted against them, decisively. Julian Vance, watching his carefully constructed coalition begin to fray, felt a knot of cold dread in his stomach. The logic of parochial deals was no match for the raw primal fear of a 30-second attack ad. They were losing the narrative war. Late that night, Pelosi summoned him back to her office. The room was dark except for the single desk lamp, which cast her face in sharp, unforgiving relief. She looked tired, older than she had at dawn. The whip count sheet lay on the desk between them, a battlefield littered with casualties. They were 5 votes down, and the numbers were moving in the wrong direction. All the conventional tools had been used. All the standard levers of power had been pulled. The situation was dire. The bill, her legacy, was on the brink of collapse. She was silent for a long time, her gaze distant, looking at something beyond the walls of her office, perhaps back through the decades of fights she had won and lost. Julian waited, his own exhaustion a heavy cloak on his shoulders. He had failed. He had brought his queen a faltering army. Then, Pelosi's eyes focused on him, and they held a new intensity, a flinty hardness that made him shift uncomfortably. She didn't speak. She simply reached into a locked drawer in her desk and pulled out a single thin manila folder. It had no label. She slid it across the desk. It stopped a few inches from his hand. Her gaze was an instruction, a transfer of a burden too heavy and too dirty for the speaker herself to carry. This was not a folder of polling data or budget reports. It was something different. It was a weapon of last resort. Julian stared at the folder, then at her face. An understanding passed between them, silent and absolute. The conventional war was over. The rules were about to be broken. His mission was no longer about persuasion or leverage. It was about finding the one person who could be broken, and using the contents of that folder to do it. He picked it up. It felt cold in his hand, a chilling premonition of the line he was about to cross. Julian walked out of the speaker's office and into the deserted, echoing hallway of the Capitol. The folder was tucked inside his jacket, a toxic secret pressed against his chest. He felt as though the marble statues of Jefferson and Washington were watching him with blind, accusing eyes. He was no longer just a legislative director. He had become a custodian of someone's ruin. He didn't know whose ruin it was yet, only that his task was to deploy it with surgical precision. The target was a man named Augustus Thorne, a fifth-term Republican from a deep South state, a man considered an immovable object. Thorne was a pillar of his party's conservative wing, a man who preached fiscal austerity and moral certitude from the House floor, with the thundering conviction of a backcountry evangelist. He was on paper the last person who would ever vote for Pelosi's bill. He was also, according to the speaker's preternatural instincts, the precise weak point in McCarthy's armor. A man who projects such an unassailable fortress of virtue often has the most to hide. The contents of the folder were devastatingly simple. Not a financial scandal, not a political indiscretion, but something deeply personal and tragically human. It contained meticulously gathered evidence, property deeds, encrypted emails, travel manifests that Thorne, the champion of family values, had for years been quietly supporting the secret second family, a mistress and a young son, in a different state. More critically, the son had a rare and aggressive form of leukemia. The treatment was astronomically expensive, And Thorne had been channeling untraceable funds through a complex web of shell corporations to pay for it. A violation of campaign finance laws and a betrayal of the public image upon which his entire career was built. The bill on Pelosi's desk, in one of its thousands of arcane subsections, contained a massive expansion of the children's health insurance program, including full coverage for experimental cancer treatments of the exact type the boy needed. It was a coincidence of such exquisite cruelty that it felt like a plot point from a Greek tragedy. To vote for the bill would be to save his son. To vote against it would be to maintain his political life. The folder didn't need to be brandished. Its existence was enough. Julian didn't approach Thorne directly. That would be too crude. Instead, he arranged a meeting with Thorne's long-serving chief of staff, a man named Henderson, as discreet and gray as his name. They met not in the Capitol, but in the somber, hushed reading room of the Library of Congress, surrounded by millions of sleeping books, a temple of knowledge now co-opted for a moment of ugly coercion. Julian placed the unmarked manila folder on the table between them. He never opened it. Henderson, a man accustomed to the brutal thrust and parry of Washington, looked at the folder and then at Julian's impassive face. His own face, normally a mask of professional competence, sagged. A decade of loyal service to his boss, and it had come to this. He understood immediately. This was not a negotiation. It was a checkmate. Julian simply slid the folder back into his jacket, the gesture as final as a closing coffin lid. The choice was Thorne's, but the outcome was predetermined. The final 72 hours before the vote were a frantic, sleepless blur. The Capitol felt like a pressure cooker, the atmosphere crackling with anticipation. Protesters for and against. The bill thronged the grounds outside, their chants a dull roar that seeped through the thick stone walls. McCarthy, sensing victory was near, held continuous caucus meetings, drilling his members on talking points, his voice hoarse, his eyes burning with zeal. He was confident. Thorne was his rock, a man he had praised at a prayer breakfast just a week earlier as the conscience of the party. He believed his wall would hold. Pelosi, by contrast, was an island of unnerving calm. She held no big meetings. She made no grand speeches. She spent hours in her office, seemingly reading historical biographies, projecting an aura of supreme confidence that baffled her allies and unnerved her enemies. She had dispatched her weapon, and now she simply waited for its effect. The day of the vote arrived, gray and overcast, the sky a lid of dirty pewter. The House chamber was packed, every seat was filled. The galleries overflowed with staff, press, and dignitaries. The air was heavy, almost unbreathable. The formal debate began, a final, ritualized performance of the arguments that had raged for weeks. McCarthy took to the floor for the final speech in opposition. He was magnificent, a gladiator in his element. He spoke of runaway inflation, of mortgaging the country's future, of a nation standing on the precipice of a fiscal abyss. His caucus rose to its feet, roaring its approval, a wave of defiant energy. Then came the speaker's designated closer, who spoke of crumbling bridges and forgotten communities, of a nation's duty to invest in itself. Finally, the speaker pro tempore called the question. The voting will be by electronic device, the voice boomed. 15 minutes. A hush fell over the chamber. All eyes turned to the massive electronic tally boards on the walls. The voting began. Names lit up, one by one. Green for YEA, red for nay. The initial count was predictable, tracking almost perfectly with the party line split. With 5 minutes remaining, the tally stood at 212 YEAs to 215 nays. The bill was failing. McCarthy allowed a tight, triumphant smile to flicker across his lips. He had held the line. He glanced over at Thorne, expecting a look of solidarity, but Thorne was staring straight ahead, his face a ghastly pale mask. He hadn't voted yet. Nor had a handful of other undecideds, caught in the paralyzing crossfire. The chamber was silent. Now the clock was a torturous slow drip. 3 minutes. 2 minutes. A few wavering Democrats, seeing the likely failure, switched their votes to NAY, a move of political self-preservation to avoid being on the losing side of a controversial vote. The nay column ticked up to 218. It was over. McCarthy's aides began to discreetly pat each other on the back. Then, with just 90 seconds left on the clock, Augustus Thorne rose from his seat. He looked neither left nor right. He walked, stiffly, down the center aisle to the well of the House, toward the paper ballots used by members whose electronic voting cards malfunction. It was a walk of shame or of sacrifice. Every eye in the chamber was on him. He picked up a pen, his hand trembling slightly. He marked a green ballot. Thorne votes yea, an aide murmured into a microphone. On the giant board, the tally shifted. 213 to 218. A ripple of shock went through the Republican side. McCarthy's smile vanished, replaced by a look of stunned disbelief. Thorne's vote was a signal. The spell was broken. 2 moderate Republicans, who represented districts that would massively benefit from the bill, and who had been granted permission by McCarthy to vote their conscience only if the bill was guaranteed to fail anyway, now saw their opening. They had their political cover. They punched their cards. Green. Gerb flashed. 215 to 216. One final Democrat, the terrified moderate from the deep red state who had been hiding in the cloakroom, saw the tide turn. A path to victory had materialized. He scurried to his seat and voted YEA, 216 to 216. A tie. All that remained was one freshman Democrat, an idealist who had pledged to her constituents that she would never vote for a bill that wasn't fully paid for. The bill, despite Pelosi's efforts, contained deficit spending. For weeks, she had held firm. Julian Vance found her by the doorway, her face anguished. He didn't show her a folder. He didn't threaten her. He simply whispered in her ear, his words inaudible to anyone else, describing the experimental cancer treatments, the lead pipes being replaced for poor children, the future she could either enable or extinguish over a principle that, in the grand scheme, was a rounding error. He was painting a picture, appealing not to her ambition, but to her heart, using the truth of the bill's good intentions as his final desperate tool. Her eyes filled with tears. With seconds to spare, she cast her vote. Green, the final tally. Locked into place. 217 yeas, 216 nays. A gavel slammed down. A roar erupted from the Democratic side of the chamber. It was done. Pelosi, seated in the speaker's chair, allowed herself a small, serene smile. She had won. Her legacy was secure. McCarthy stood frozen, his face a thunderous canvas of betrayal. He stared at Thorne, who was already walking out of the chamber, a ghost disappearing into the crowd, his political career over, his son's future secured. But the story did not end in the speaker's triumphant office, amidst the popping champagne corks and jubilant backslapping. It ended hours later in the dead of night with Julian Vance. He stood alone on the speaker's balcony, overlooking the darkened National Mall. The celebration inside felt 1,000,000 miles away. The victory felt hollow, coated in a fine dust of moral compromise. The city lights twinkled below, a map of the nation he had just helped, in his own small, dark way, to rebuild. He pulled out his phone, his thumb hovering over a contact. It wasn't the speaker. It was his own personal doctor. He opened a secure messaging app and typed a message, his fingers numb. Did the preliminary scan show anything? He had been feeling unwell for months. An exhaustion that sleep couldn't cure. A dull ache deep in his bones he had dismissed as stress. The reply came back almost instantly. It was a single encrypted file. A lab report. He opened it, his heart a cold, hard knot in his chest. The camera of this silent docudrama would zoom in, not on the complex medical terminology, but on two words in the diagnosis summary: acute myeloid leukemia. The same disease that afflicted Augustus Thorne's son. In a moment of sickening, cosmic irony, Julian realized the devastating truth. The bill he had sold his soul to pass, the legislation that would now fund the very treatment that might save him, was both his greatest professional triumph and a monument to his own personal tragedy. The fall from grace was not political. It was cellular. He had secured the future of the nation's infrastructure, but the foundations of his own life were crumbling beneath him. He stood there, alone in the dark, the architect of a grand victory, now facing his own unresolved, and perhaps unresolvable, human dilemma. The roar of the victory party was a distant, distorted surf, crashing against the shores of Julian Vance's new and terrifyingly silent inner world. He stood on the balcony, the chill of the night air a welcome anesthetic against the fever bloom of his own mortality. The city lights below, once a symbol of conquered territory, now seemed like the cold, indifferent stars of a vast and empty universe. He put the phone back in his pocket, the lab-reported digital phantom now seared onto his soul. The words acute myeloid leukemia were a quiet, invasive malignancy, far more potent than any political opponent. He had just navigated the Byzantine complexities of the United States Congress, bending wills and breaking a man to pass $1 trillion bill. Yet he was powerless against this mutiny in his own blood. He turned from the abyss and pushed the French doors open, stepping back into the maelstrom of celebration. The air in the speaker's office was thick with the scent of expensive perfume, catered food, and self-congratulation. The speaker herself, Nancy Pelosi, stood at the center of a knot of her most senior deputies, a flute of champagne held aloft. Not in triumph, but with the casual authority of a monarch surveying her court after a successful crusade. Her eyes met Julian's across the room. She gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, a gesture of profound proprietary approval. You did this. You delivered. To her, he was the instrument of her will, the sharpest blade in her armory. He looked at her, at the architects of this grand victory, and saw not colleagues, but ghosts at a feast. He felt a profound and horrifying detachment, as if watching a scene from a life he used to inhabit. He moved towards the bar, poured himself a glass of water, and felt the crushing weight of the irony. He had orchestrated a political masterpiece to fund a cure for a secret he didn't even know he held. He had traded one man's hidden suffering for the public good, only to find himself a secret sharer in that same silent affliction. The water was tasteless. The sounds of joy were a dissonant shriek in another part of the sleeping city. In a minimalist office that eschewed history for brutalist functionality, there was no champagne. There was only the dead quiet of absolute defeat. Kevin McCarthy sat alone at his conference table, the whiteboard from weeks before now wiped clean, a sterile blank monument to his failure. The rally cries of socialist wish list and driving tax seemed like pathetic, hollow echoes. He had not been defeated by an argument. He had been gutted by a betrayal. His chief of staff, Brock, the ex-Marine, stood at the window, his back to his leader, staring out at the illuminated dome of the Capitol. It looked to him now like a mausoleum. For an hour, neither man had spoken. The fury had burned itself out, leaving behind a cold, hard ash of resolve. McCarthy finally broke the silence, his voice a low, dangerous rasp. He did not ask what had happened. He stated a mission. He did not need to raise his voice or spell it out. His gaze shifted from the blank whiteboard to Brock. An order was given without a word being exchanged. Find out why. Find out how. Find the source of the rot that had crumbled his foundation. It was no longer a legislative fight. It had become a blood feud. Brock nodded once, a curt, lethal acknowledgement. His new war had just begun. The days that followed were a study in fractured reality for Julian. On the surface, his life was a succession of victory laps. He sat in strategy meetings under the warm glow of the speaker's praise, mapping out the public relations rollout for the American Renewal and Infrastructure Act. He drafted talking points about the millions of jobs to be created, the clean water that would flow, the digital divide that would be bridged. He was the architect of the narrative, the celebrated wunderkind who had snatched victory from the jaws of defeat. But this public performance was a thin veneer over a secret, frantic scramble. Between meetings, he locked his office door, and the triumphant policy documents were pushed aside for medical journals and the websites of oncology clinics. He found the precise subsection in the bill, deep in Title VII, that outlined the pilot program for funding experimental cellular therapies. He read the dense, bureaucratic language not as a legislator, but as a drowning man reading the schematics for a life raft. He made hushed, encrypted calls from burner phones to cancer centers in Houston and Boston, his voice stripped of its usual confident cadence, replaced by the humble questioning tone of a supplicant. He was living a chilling duality, a man simultaneously authoring the nation's future while desperately trying to secure his own. Brock's hunt began not with a bang, but with the meticulous grinding work of data mining. He operated from a secure, off-site location, a corporate sublet that had no official connection to the minority leader's office. He was a ghost, pursuing a ghost. He started with Augustus Thorne. The man himself had vanished. His congressional office was shuttered. His D.C. apartment was empty. He had issued a terse, one-sentence press release, announcing his immediate resignation for pressing family health matters, and had retreated into absolute silence. To the media, it was a minor, puzzling footnote to the larger drama of the infrastructure vote. To Brock, it was the point of origin, the ground zero of his investigation. He bypassed financial records first. Blackmail of that nature was too common, too easily survivable for a man of Thorne's stature. Brock believed the wound was deeper, more personal. He started tracking Thorne's movements for the past 2 years. Not his official travel, but his private life. He requisitioned private jet manifests, cell phone tower triangulation data, credit card receipts from obscure hotels. It was a painstaking assembly of a secret mosaic. Slowly, a pattern emerged. Dozens of trips, all to one city, Philadelphia. A city nowhere near Thorne's district, with no political significance to him. A city that was home to one of the finest children's hospitals in the world. Brock circled the name of the hospital on a map. He could smell the wound. Julian, meanwhile, was wrestling with the ghost of his own making. He couldn't shake the image of Thorne walking down the aisle to cast that vote, a man sacrificing his public life on a secret altar. He felt an unnerving, unwelcome kinship with the man he had broken. One night, unable to sleep, he drove to the Library of Congress. He didn't go inside. He just sat in his car, parked across the street, staring at the grand silent building where he delivered the ultimatum. The manila folder was still in a safe in his apartment, a totem of his sin. He hadn't destroyed it. He couldn't. It felt like destroying a piece of his own history, a confession he was too cowardly to make and too haunted to erase. He wondered if Henderson, Thorne's chief of staff, had told him how the Speaker's office knew. Had he described the impassive face of the man who held his life in his hands? The thought sent a wave of nausea through him. He drove home through the empty streets, the weight of his secret, a physical presence in the passenger seat beside him. Brock's first major break came from an unlikely source. Using a cutout, a private investigator with a plausible cover story, he made contact with a disgruntled billing administrator at the Philadelphia hospital. The administrator, bitter over being passed over for a promotion, was willing to talk for a price. He couldn't access sealed medical files, but he could access donor records and visitor logs. He confirmed the existence of a pediatric oncology patient, a young boy, whose astronomical expenses were being covered by a series of anonymous wire transfers from a Delaware-based shell corporation. He then cross-referenced visitor logs for the secure oncology wing. For 18 months, Augustus Thorne had signed in, twice a week, to visit this specific patient. Brock now had the what, the secret family, the sick son. The motive for Thorne's desperate, career-ending vote was laid bare. But the "shao" remained elusive. How had Pelosi's office discovered a secret so carefully, so expensively buried? Who had the resources to connect those dots and the ruthlessness to weaponize? A dying child? There was only one person in the speaker's orbit with that reputation: Julian Vance, the celebrated strategist. The name clicked into place in Brock's mind, a key turning in a lock. The pressure on Julian was mounting from all sides. His doctors in Boston had a potential slot for him in a new clinical trial, a cutting-edge CAR T-cell therapy funded by a grant from the very bill he had passed. The irony was a knife that twisted with every thought. They needed a decision within the week. His life was now on a deadline, measured not in legislative sessions, but in blood counts. At the same time, the speaker had begun to watch him. She noticed the weight loss, the dark circles under his eyes that no amount of sleep could erase, the way he would sometimes zone out in meetings, his stare fixed on some distant, interior horror. One afternoon, she called him into her office. She offered him a promotion, a new title: Deputy Chief of Staff for Implementation. It sounded prestigious. It was, in fact, a demotion. It would take him off the front lines of the political battlefield and move him into the bureaucratic world of interagency coordination. It was a golden parachute, a soft landing. It was a move to contain him. She didn't know his secret, but her political instincts, honed over a lifetime of spotting weakness, told her that her chief weapon had become unstable. "You've earned a chance to see your work bear fruit, Julian," she had said, her voice smooth as silk. A chance to build, not just to fight. It was a gift, wrapped around a command. Step back. Brock, now convinced he had his target, moved his investigation to Washington. He began reconstructing Julian's life, his movements, his meetings in the weeks leading up to the vote. He was no longer looking for data points. He was looking for the scene of the crime. He compiled a list of every person Julian had met with, cross-referencing official schedules with unofficial sightings from his network of conservative-leaning Capitol Hill staffers and police. The meeting with the freshman Republican in the cafeteria, the quiet chat with the Progressive Caucus leader. All standard political horse trading. Then he came to the day before the whip count miraculously flipped. Julian had disappeared for 2 hours in the afternoon. No scheduled meetings. His office said he was doing off-site outreach. It was a hole in the timeline, a black box. Where did he go? Who did he meet? Brock's mind went back to the meeting between Julian and Thorne's chief of staff, Henderson. It would have to have been a neutral site, secure, anonymous, a place where two powerful staffers could meet without raising eyebrows. His thoughts drifted over the landscape of Capitol Hill. He methodically ruled out restaurants, bars, and office buildings. Too public, too many witnesses. He needed a place that was both grand and forgettable, a place people passed through without truly seeing. His gaze fell upon a map of the Hill and settled on the vast sprawling complex of the Library of Congress, a public place, yet filled with quiet, anonymous corners. He dispatched his private investigator to the library's security office with a plausibly forged request from a fictional subcommittee, asking for visitor log and security footage archives for a specific 2-hour window on a specific date, citing a minor security review. It was a long shot, a needle in a haystack. Days later, the investigator returned with a drive. It contained hours of grainy, silent footage from the public areas of the library. Brock sat in his sterile temporary office, the only light coming from his laptop screen as he fast-forwarded through the footage. He saw tourists and scholars, aides and interns. And then, he saw it. Julian Vance, entering the main reading room. His face a mask of purpose, he took a seat at an empty table. Minutes later, he was joined by another man. A gray, unassuming man. Brock didn't recognize him at first. He paused the frame, zoomed in on the man's face, and ran it through a facial recognition program cross-referenced with congressional staff directories. The result came back: Franklin Henderson, Chief of Staff to former Representative Augustus Thorne. Brock felt a jolt of ice-cold adrenaline. This was it, the meeting. The moment of transmission. He watched the silent, grainy pantomime. He couldn't hear the words, but he saw the most critical moment. He saw Julian slide a thin manila folder across the table. He saw the color drain from Henderson's face. He saw Henderson's posture collapse, the posture of a man receiving the death sentence. He saw Julian retrieve the folder and walk away. His purpose served. Brock leaned back, his heart pounding. He had it. He had the scene, the actors, the motive. He had the entire sordid conspiracy. He could now trace the direct line from a sick child in Philadelphia to the speaker's enforcer, to the vote that had cost his party control of the nation's future. The blackmail wasn't a theory anymore. It was a visible, provable act. His first instinct was to go public, to detonate the entire scandal and burn the speaker's victory to the ground. But he paused. A public explosion would be messy, the fallout unpredictable. He needed to present his findings to McCarthy first, and he needed one final piece of evidence. The weapon itself, the contents of that manila folder, where was it? His new hunt had a new target, not a man but an object. A file that held the power to destroy Julian Vance and taint the speaker's legacy forever. The net was no longer just tightening. It was beginning to close, its strands woven from grainy video, flight manifests, and one father's desperate, impossible choice. Julian's body had become a foreign country, a landscape of unpredictable betrayals. One moment he would be standing in the statuary hall, articulating the finer points of a public works grant allocation, and the next, a dizzying wave of vertigo would wash over him, the marble floor seeming to tilt beneath his feet. The stoic faces of the bronze and stone statesmen would blur into a meaningless vortex. He would grip a balustrade, his knuckles white, forcing a bland smile, attributing the spell to a missed lunch or a late night. But he knew. It was the mutiny in his marrow, a slow-motion coup against the sovereignty of his own mind. He had started. Having nosebleeds, sudden and profuse, once in the middle of a conference call, forcing him to feign a dropped connection as he frantically tilted his head back, the coppery taste of his own failure filling his throat. Each instance was a small, terrifying rehearsal for a final public collapse. The carefully constructed edifice of Julian Vance, the unflappable operator, was being hollowed out from the inside. This decay did not go unnoticed. The speaker, a predator of human frailty, observed him with an unnerving clinical eye. Her decision to sideline him into the implementation role had been the first sign. The second came during a tense budget reconciliation meeting. As Julian laid out a complex flowchart of agency funding, his voice, normally a crisp and confident instrument, wavered. He lost his place. For 3 agonizing seconds, he stared blankly at the projection screen, the data dissolving into meaningless squiggles. An aide coughed discreetly. Pelosi intervened without missing a beat, picking up his thread of argument, her own voice a seamless and powerful continuation. She covered for him perfectly, but her look was unmistakable. It was not one of sympathy, but of calculation. She was assessing the operational liability of a damaged asset. Later that day, she called him to her private study, a smaller, more intimate room off her main office. "Julian," she began, her tone a soft purr that raised the hairs on his neck. This victory was draining for us all. You gave everything. I want you to take a month. Go somewhere warm. Recharge. It was not an offer. It was an order of exile, dressed up as a kindness. He saw the path she was laying for him. A quiet exit, a face-saving resignation for health reasons a few months down the line. The system that had made him was now preparing to digest him. He met her gaze and lied. I appreciate that, Madam Speaker, but I'm fine, just tired. The work is too important to step away now. Her smile was thin, a bloodless wound. As you wish, she said, but her eyes conveyed the true message. The clock is now ticking on your utility. Brock, meanwhile, was operating with the cold patience of a sniper. The grainy footage from the Library of Congress was his Rosetta Stone. He had the meeting, but he needed to know what was in the folder. His investigation moved from the digital to the human. He began building a psychological profile of Julian Vance, interviewing former colleagues, estranged friends, anyone who had moved through Julian's orbit before he became the speaker's enforcer. He found a recurring theme: the bright, idealistic young staffer who had been consumed by the machine, his ambition calcifying into a ruthless pragmatism. It was in one of these interviews that he found his key. He sat down for coffee with David Markham, a senior legislative counsel, now semi-retired, a man universally respected for his institutional knowledge and his rigid, old-school ethics. Markham had been Julian's first boss on the Hill, his mentor. Brock presented himself not as a partisan operative, but as a fellow institutionalist, concerned about the erosion of norms. I worry about the young ones, David, Brock began, his voice laced with feigned weariness. The pressure cooker on the Hill now, it changes people. I look at a kid as smart as Vance, and I worry he's losing his way, cutting corners. That can't be uncut. Markham, a man who cherished the memory of bipartisan compromise, took the bait. He sighed, a deep, sorrowful sound. Julian was the best I ever had, sharp as a razor, but he had a heart. He believed in the work. Now, I don't know. He's become secretive, paranoid. Brock leaned in, his expression one of gentle concern. Paranoid? How so? Markham hesitated, loyalty warring with a deep-seated disapproval. After he got the promotion with Pelosi, he changed. He cut off old friends. Talked about security. Even had a top-of-the-line safe installed in his apartment. Said he was handling documents of national importance. Brock's heart hammered against his ribs. A safe, it was the confirmation he needed. He pressed gently. A man has a right. To his privacy, of course. Just hope he's not getting in over his head. Markham just shook his head sadly, a man mourning a protege he no longer recognized. The conversation ended, with Brock having secured the one piece of tactical information he needed. He knew where the weapon was kept. Julian's deadline was no longer political. It was medical. The clinic in Boston called again. The slot in the trial would not wait. The pre-treatment protocol had to begin immediately. He sat in his darkened apartment, the city's lights a taunting reminder of a world that was moving on without him. The choice was brutally simple: stay in D.C. to guard the lie of his professional life, or fly to Boston to fight for his actual one. For a man who had dedicated his entire existence to the intricate game of power, the decision was an excruciating act of surrender. It meant admitting defeat, not to McCarthy or the opposition, but to his own rebelling cells. After a long, agonizing hour, he picked up his phone and booked a one-way ticket to Logan International Airport. The confirmation email arrived, an itinerary for his own salvation, and a death warrant for the career he had built. His final night in Washington was a purgatory of loose ends. He began to pack, his movements slow and clumsy. He was systematically dismantling his life, reducing it to the contents of a single suitcase. Then his eyes fell on the safe, a black monolithic cube in his closet. Inside lay the manila folder. The urtext of his sin. He couldn't leave it there. He couldn't risk some future tenant, some fluke, uncovering it. He couldn't take it with him. It felt like packing a venomous snake in his luggage. It had to be unmade, erased. His first thought was the shredder, but he imagined some determined forensic investigator painstakingly reassembling the strips. It had to be ash. He took the folder out, its flimsy cardboard cool to the touch. He didn't look at the contents, the property deeds, the encrypted emails, the terrifyingly clinical printouts that detailed a stranger's private agony. He carried it to the small decorative fireplace in his living room, a feature he had never once used. He crumpled the papers, stuffed them inside the folder, and lit a corner with his lighter. The flame caught, first tentatively, then hungrily. He watched as the paper curled, blackened, and disintegrated. The words and numbers that had destroyed Augustus Thorne's life turned to smoke. It was a private, profane sacrament. A deep, shuddering sigh of relief escaped him. He had unburdened himself of the evidence. He was free. Exhausted and weak, he took the bag of trash from his kitchen, which contained empty takeout containers and a few discarded pieces of mail, including the crumpled-up printout of his lab. Results he had glanced at in a moment of despair and dropped it down the building's refuse chute. A final act of cleansing before his departure. He did one last sweep of the apartment and left, his keys on the counter, a ghost abandoning his own haunting. Brock had not been idle. Through a series of encrypted communications and third-party cutouts, he had contracted a specialist. A man, known only as the janitor, a former intelligence agency operative, who now worked for exorbitant fees in the gray market of corporate and political espionage. His specialty was non-destructive entry and covert asset retrieval. While Julian was booking his flight to Boston, the janitor was sitting in a van half a block from Julian's apartment building, studying blueprints and disabling the building's silent alarm systems with a laptop. Brock's order was precise. Acquire the contents of a specific model of safe in the apartment's master closet. The janitor was to be a scalpel, not a sledgehammer. No trace of entry. No collateral damage. Hours after Julian's taxi had departed. For the airport, the janitor went to work. He moved with an unnerving, fluid grace, bypassing the lobby security with a cloned keycard, ascending in the service elevator, and picking the high-security lock on Julian's apartment door in under a minute. The apartment was still silent, holding the faint scent of burnt paper. The janitor swept the apartment for bugs, then moved to the closet. He ran a diagnostic on the safe, a small electronic device mapping its internal mechanisms. After 20 minutes of silent, intense work, a soft click echoed in the closet. The safe door swung open. It was empty. The janitor swept his gloved hand inside. Nothing. He communicated his failure to Brock in a one-word encrypted text. Hollow. Brock sat in his command center, a cold fury rising within him. Julian had anticipated him. He had destroyed the evidence. It was a stunning defeat. He was about to abort the mission when the janitor sent a second message. Contingency search? Brock paused. The primary objective was lost, but perhaps there was something else, some secondary piece of leverage. Julian might have been thorough, but was he perfect? Brock gave the command. Proceed. The janitor began a systematic forensic sweep of the apartment. He photographed everything, documented everything. He found the cold fireplace, the faint film of ash. He took a sample, but knew it was likely useless. The trail was dead. He was about to leave when he performed his final protocol. Waste analysis. Every professional knew that people were careless with their trash. The apartment's chute led to a central compactor in the basement. Using his access keycard, he entered the trash room, located the specific bag he knew must be Julian's from the time of its disposal, and sliced it open with a knife. He sifted through the day-old food, the junk mail. And then he found it. A single crumpled piece of paper, thrown away in a moment of despair. It wasn't a political document. It wasn't about Augustus Thorne. It was a lab report from a Boston oncology center. He flattened the paper, his penlight illuminating the dense medical text. He didn't understand all the terms, but he understood the summary line, typed in stark, bold letters. Diagnosis: acute myeloid leukemia. Prognosis: critical. The janitor took a high-resolution photograph of the document and sent it, encrypted, to Brock. Then he placed the paper back in the trash bag, erased his digital and physical footprints from the building, and vanished back into the city's shadows. Back in his office, Brock opened the file on his laptop. The image of the lab report filled the screen. He read the diagnosis. He read the name of the clinic. He read the horrifying prognosis. A chill, entirely different from the adrenaline of the hunt, snaked down his spine. He had sent a spy to uncover a crime and had, instead, stumbled upon a man's death sentence. The blackmail file was gone, turned to ash. The political weapon he sought had been replaced with something infinitely more potent and infinitely more monstrous. It was a violation not of political ethics, but of a fundamental human boundary. He thought of McCarthy, of his thirst for retribution. What would his boss do with this? This wasn't a tool of political warfare. It was a shard of a man's soul. He had set out to find a fall from grace, and had found himself staring into the abyss of another man's deepest, most personal hell. For the first time in the entire operation, Brock felt a tremor of fear, not for the mission, but for what they were about to become. The folder was gone, but the ghost was now truly in the machine, and its name was not Thorne, but Vance. Unresolved ethical dilemma was no longer a future prospect. It was staring at him from a laptop screen, glowing in the dark.